Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode. So we have Dr. Kristina Spaulding. She owns Science Matters Academy of Animal Behavior. She has a PhD in biopsychology, which is a study of biological basis of behavior. Super awesome, super interesting. And she's also a certified applied animal behaviorist. She teaches a wide variety of online courses and webinars, and we will link her website in the show notes, so you can just have a click on there, very easy. And she's also written the most amazing book called The Stress Factor in Dogs, Unlocking Resiliency and Enhancing Well-Being.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, we're super excited to talk to you. It's going to be proper geeky, sciencey session.
Yes, I'm always happy to talk about stress.
Yay. Okay, so let's start off then with stress, because obviously, as we are behaviorists in dogs and stuff, so obviously it's one of the most common things that we kind of see, and there's so many different types of it. So do you want to maybe like define what is stress and the different types of stress as well? Because not all stress is bad, is it? So
Right. Yes. So stress refers to a specific physiological response to some kind of basically threat to the status quo. So the easiest way to think of it is it's a physiological response to change. So it involves two different types of responses. So you have the release of cortisol, which is often referred to as a stress hormone. And you also have activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which involves the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, which are now technically called epinephrine and norepinephrine, but it's basically the same thing. That's a whole long story. We won't get into that. And so that's what stress is. It's simply a physiological response. It's basically what causes the fight or flight response, although there are many more. It's not just fight or flight, right? As we know, there are many other possible responses to stress, and people have come up with all kinds of other Fs like fidget and freeze and things like that. So that's what stress is. And then Dr. Bruce McEwen came up with 3 categories of stress. So people will often talk about stress and eustress. That is sort of basically bad stress and good stress. But I like his categorization much better. So he talks about good stress. So that is a challenge that ends up being beneficial for the individual in the long run. So that could be getting married is a very common example, is that, weddings are stressful, but generally they're considered positive things. So that would be an example of good stress, but also simply learning or traveling we're talking about people here, right? But we can kind of think of equivalent analogies in our dogs. Even exercise is stress, right? And so, but that can all be good stress. And then you have tolerable stress, which is distressing. So I guess I should mention good stress is not generally upsetting in the moment. It's just a response to change or a response to challenge. Tolerable stress is upsetting. So whatever you're experiencing is causing distress, but the individual has the ability to cope with that stress, and therefore it doesn't have any long-term negative impacts, and again, can actually end up being positive in the long run. And we can all think of situations that can cause tolerable stress as well. Also travel, also weddings, or, it could be other things like the loss of a job, or for a dog going to the veterinary clinic, or a thunderstorm, right? And then the last category is toxic stress, and that's when it's distressing and it exceeds the animal's ability to cope. And that's where we really see pretty serious negative impacts. And usually when we're talking about stress, we're talking about toxic stress. And one thing that I think it's really important for people to understand is that the trigger, the stressor, is not so much the important factor. It's how the animal responds to that stressor. So I just talked about how a wedding could be, good stress or tolerable stress, or it could even be toxic stress for certain individuals. Or for a dog, we talked about going to the vet and thunderstorms. For some dogs, going to the vet is actually good stress. I mean, they're happy. They get to see people and they get to, probably get a bunch of treats. And so that's fun for them. Most dogs, it's tolerable stress. And then a certain percentage of dogs, it's toxic stress.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just you talking about weddings and doing the human versions as well, actually, like I was just thinking, like if I go, like, so I find it stressful if I'm in an environment where I don't know anyone, for instance, or I go to like a new place. And so we kind of expect our dogs to be fine in so many different environments. And actually you just using that human analogy, I was already just feeling stressed when you're talking about weddings and things like, because that for me, going to like a busy place with loads of people and I don't know them, I find that stressful. So it's just, no, it's really, really interesting. And in terms of like, so say toxic stress, so I specialize in separation anxiety, for instance. And so I get a lot of dogs that before they start working with me, they go into that panic kind of state.
Yes.
Would you define that as toxic stress, or would you define that?
So if we're saying that they're panicking when you leave, then yes, I would say that that is very likely to be toxic stress. Leaving is another great example. Probably for most dogs, it's not good stress. Excuse me. But maybe in some cases, if you have like a really hectic household with lots of kids and then they all leave, maybe the dog is like, now I get a break. Or it could just be sort of neutral, right? They're used to it and it's not even really a stressor. But then for some dogs, it'll be tolerable. And then those separation anxiety dogs, that is truly toxic stress. And I think a lot about separation anxiety dogs when we're talking about toxic stress, because one of the things that makes stress toxic is when it's chronic, when it's happening over and over and over again. And so if you have a dog that has untreated separation anxiety and they're still being left on a daily or almost daily basis, those guys are experiencing chronic stress, which is really very, very damaging to the animal.
Yeah. And like from a physical point of view, like how damaging can stress be like long term?
So if we go back to thinking about what stress does, it creates this fight or flight response and it causes the activations of these two systems. And the function of stress is to prepare the animal to face whatever this challenge may be. And so the classic example is the zebra running from the lion. And so both of those animals are facing stress and their systems are mobilizing them to prepare for that challenge. And so that means doing things like you're basically activating the systems that are needed to survive in that moment. So that means things like increasing respiration, increasing blood flow, providing glucose, energy into the bloodstream for that immediate energy, and increase of sort of perception, at least perception of threats. And then other things get shut down. So things that aren't needed to survive in that instant get shut down. And so that's going to be things like digestion, growth, reproduction, certain aspects of the immune system. And if you think about that happening day after day after day, you can imagine how that's going to impact the system. And so individuals that are experiencing chronic stress can have a wide range of physical symptoms, and that can include things like skin issues, which is probably because of the suppression of the immune system, increased susceptibility to illness, GI problems, issues with growth, and there's probably a link to pain. And in humans, we know, we don't have this kind of data in dogs, but in humans, we know that stress leads to things like increased incidence of autoimmune disorders, increase in diabetes, increase in heart disease, and even early death. I mean, literally, like every time I say that, I feel like I'm exaggerating and being overly dramatic, but we have good data that shows that chronic stress decreases lifespan. And there's one study in dogs that found that link as well. There's only one study been done on that specific topic in dogs that I know of, but it really is very detrimental. And now you have the psychological impacts of chronic stress and being in this situation that the animal is not able to cope with, that become compounded by starting to have these physical issues as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I have a question in terms of like recovering from stress, that recovery time, like especially from chronic stress. So something that is very common, especially in like the area that I work, a lot of behaviorists will put the dogs on like a cortisol holiday, where it's like for a month, the dogs don't really go out, like obviously limited exposure to the triggers and stuff. Is it like, because I think also it's 72 hours before stress returns to baseline level, or what is the correct kind of thing to do?
So, yes. So that number, that 72-hour or 3-day number, is thrown out very frequently. I don't know where that comes from. I haven't been able to find anything in the literature that suggests that specific number. So in a health, so when we're talking about recovery time, it's very difficult to give a clear answer to that, because there are so many factors that influence it. So first of all, we know that probably the sort of, I guess you can't associate me, but I'm putting this in quotes, the sort of typical or average recovery time for a stressor is somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes. But that's going to depend on like 100 million different things. So it's going to depend on whether or not the animal is experiencing good, tolerable, or toxic stress. It probably depends on the life stage of the individual. It may vary according to sex. It's going to depend on the strength of the stressor, and it's going to depend on whether or not the animal is experiencing toxic stress. It's going to depend on, other hormone concentrations in the body. And so it's very, very difficult to say. But for a healthy, emotionally healthy animal whose stress response system is functioning correctly, which we can talk more about why it might not be functioning correctly in a moment, probably the typical recovery time is somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes. So that 3-day span, I don't know where that comes from. The only thing that I have seen is that in the learned helplessness research, when in a lab, where things are much cleaner and more controlled, animals that experience learned helplessness because they cannot escape a stressor, that tends to last for about 3 days, but that is not actually related directly to the stress response. That has to do more with sensitization of certain neurons in the brain, and it takes those neurons 3 days to recover. So I don't think that 72-hour number is correct, unless there's some. So like the stress vacation, I don't know that there is harm in doing that, but I don't think there's any data to support. I mean, certainly we want to decrease stress if we want to see effective behavior change. And if we want to improve well-being in an animal that's experiencing toxic stress or even tolerable stress, because if that continues, it will become chronic, which will make it toxic. Absolutely, we want to decrease the stress levels, but I don't think we have any good data supporting any kind of specific timeline for that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And
Sorry
like,
to throw a wrench in things, but
No, it's cool.
It's like one of those things, you know, like I think I did my behavior course way back in 2009. It was like very long ago. And they make a big thing of it.
Yeah.
Like, 2 hour thing.
Yeah.
It's to like
yeah.
yeah, kind of get things like question stuff. And so say for example, you've got like, I don't know, a dog that you would label as, you know, barky, lungy, for example, that like barks the dogs, for instance. And say if they have that like stressor and they go over threshold and they do react in like that negative way towards another dog. What are like some of the best things to do to help that dog recover quicker?
Yeah.
Is there anything specific that owners can do?
So on the front end, anything you can do to reduce stress in that dog's life should help with the recovery, because all of these things become cumulative.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can look at, are there other stressors in this animal's life, or even, you know, can I increase positive experiences that can also help combat that stress? And so, and that's, we'll probably get into this more during this interview, but that can include things like increasing exercise, increasing enrichment. And when we say increasing exercise, of course, when we're talking about a dog that gets very barky, lungy on leash, that may not mean more walks, depending on
Yeah.
if you can
Yeah.
get them into an environment where they're unlikely to be triggered.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
Yeah.
there are other ways you might be able to increase exercise by, you know, play and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or choosing where you walk, which I'm sure, you know,
Yeah.
I know you
Yeah.
guys know
Yeah.
this, but your listeners are probably pretty familiar with it too. In the moment, really, I think so. Certainly, if we become very heightened and stressed, that is going to make things worse. So, or at the very least, it will not help. But if you're directing any kind of frustration or anger at the dog, or doing any kind of physical correcting or yelling, there's very likely going to increase stress, which will make things worse.
Yeah.
And so, once they have hit that point where they are barking and lunging, generally the best thing to do is to get out of there and get them to a location where things are quieter. I am a big fan of taking them to an area where there's good smells. So like, even if you're you know, if you're walking on a street or something, if you can get them to a place where there's grass or vegetation, or even like an upright surface of some kind, those all tend to be popular smelling spots, and that can help decrease the stress level. But really, a lot of it is happening actually before they have that incident.
Yeah.
And trying to manage the stress levels. And in some cases, that's going to mean medication, right? If you're, especially if you're living in an urban area or something, and you just don't have the ability to avoid the stressors, that's when it's time to talk to a veterinarian about medication.
Yeah. And just talking about that as well, like a stressful incident has occurred. So I've also heard about like the importance of like completing the stress cycle. Is that something you can kind of comment on?
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because people have brought this up to me before, and it's not a technical term. So do you know what when people are saying completing the stress cycle, what do they mean by that?
I don't know this in too much detail, but basically just like I really don't know as much detail. That's why I'm asking as well. But afterwards, like providing like stress relieving things as well. That doesn't even help at all, but
it's to do with the resilience rainbow, isn't it? I saw that IAABC had something on it. Where is
so so I can only sort of assume what they mean by that. I mean, I assume what they're meaning is that we want to help the animal, you know, bring that cortisol level back down again. And so sniffing again would help do that. Well, I mean, in many dogs, it will help do that. I don't want to make this implication that it will always help for every dog, because that's not true. But that if you can get your dog to engage in sniffing, that can be really helpful. Treat scatters can be very helpful. But I would still argue that putting the work in the rest of the time is more important than,
Yeah.
because so one thing we know, for example, is that if an animal has an experience that induces fear, so it's like something causes fear in that animal, and you go back immediately and you try and associate that thing with
Yeah.
something positive. So let's say um, that you're in your house and you have a baby gate that falls down and makes a loud noise and your dog gets scared. If you then immediately come back and start scattering food all around the baby gate for the dog to eat, research suggests that that actually doesn't help, because
Yeah.
what they think is happening is that the dog is still having the stress response. And so you can't do counter conditioning very effectively when there is an active
Yeah.
stress response occurring. And so you're better off waiting. It looks like that lasts for maybe up to 4 hours. So you're better off waiting until
Yeah.
much later to try and do that kind of counter conditioning work. But,
Okay.
I would say the biggest thing is you're trying not to add to the stress, because it's going to take as long to go down
Yeah.
as it takes to go down. There's a physiological half-life of these chemicals. And so you can't
Yeah.
necessarily
Yeah.
speed up the
Be
normal process. But if you
okay.
have a dog that tends to get stuck in stress responses, then we're really trying to move them away from triggers
Wait.
and create situations that allow them to feel safe, or can counteract that, but so again, things
Yeah.
like play,
Yeah.
physical contact, petting,
Yeah.
comfort, medication,
Yeah.
all of those things can help with that.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it makes sense. Like again,
Okay.
when you're talking and I'm comparing this to humans, it's like someone throwing a spider at me or something, or a snake or something, and then expecting me to just be okay by them putting, I don't know, like a load of sweet stuff,
Exactly.
$1,000
Right.
or something.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it's like, I have instances where I'm just in a bad mood, and if people start trying
Yeah.
to get me
Yes, and it
to
makes you
cheer up,
worse. Yeah.
right,
Yes.
often, yeah. So really, I think it's just sort of time and space, and again, getting away from the stressors,
Yes.
and even play, right? I'm
Yeah.
saying, oh, play with your dog, that can help. But I have this lovely video
Yeah.
with a client that I worked with who was an amazing client. I mean, she did everything I asked her to. But after the first appointment, we did the initial consultation, and she had told, this was during COVID, so I hadn't actually met the dog, and we were doing everything via video. And so she had told me her dog wasn't taking treats, and her dog was very barky and lungy with other dogs, and it sounded like she was doing everything right. So I suggested to her that she maybe try toys, because her dog was very toy
Yeah.
motivated. And I also asked her to get video. And so she got video, and they were trying to use a toy in the video, and the dog was completely like, wanted nothing to do with it at all. And it turns out what was happening is she just wasn't getting far enough away from the triggers, right?
Oh,
And so
yeah.
yes, play can be great, but if they're still having an active stress response, they might not want to play.
Yeah.
So, and we have to
Yeah.
respect that, right? So we don't want to try and force
No.
feed or
Yeah.
force play
Yeah.
when the dog is turning away and spitting it out,
Yeah.
because again, that's just going to make it worse.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, it's all about just teaching owners to like be able to read their dogs and to know when
Dog.
they are in like a stress response. So like 2 of my dogs are border collies, for example. So I know with them, if there's certain like things that stress them out, it's that'd be the last thing I do until I kind of see signals in their body language, even stuff like their breathing or so, to suggest, hey, they're calmer. Now we can do some work with this or something. So yeah, no, it's super interesting. So with regards to like different developmental stages of dogs as well. So one of my dogs, he's an 8-month-old Pomeranian. So he, love him. He's like my guilty pleasure dog.
So cute.
And I've noticed with him since he started adolescence, like adolescence is typically where you start to see like new behaviors coming up. So in the case of him, for example, he has now suddenly become really suspicious of like new things being suddenly there. So I was at like my training ground this morning, for example, teaching, and the bin had moved. Someone else had moved it to like 10 meters away. And he got out the car and he was like, what the hell? And he was like, I'm going to bark and shout at this thing because this isn't normally here. Whereas when he was a puppy, he didn't care about stuff like that. And we kind of see those kinds of, again, responses in adolescence. Like, is it the same kind of thing going on? Like what's kind of going on in the brain during that time for dogs to suddenly start eliciting these responses?
A lot. Yeah. And so we don't have a ton of research on adolescence in dogs, but they are mammals, and we have lots of research in humans, right? And so what we know, and this is sort of cobbling together, and a lot of this is cobbling together research from rodents, humans, and what little we have in dogs, because there just hasn't been a lot done in dogs. Luckily, everything that we know so far suggests that the vast majority of these responses, when we're talking about stress and emotion, are very, very similar, especially within mammals. So the research that we have in adolescence in other mammals tells us that there's all kinds of hormonal changes going on during adolescence, right? And there's also certain brain areas are going through very rapid growth. And anytime a brain area is going through growth, that means it makes it vulnerable to damage, basically. And so, and this is true for younger animals as well, because they're also going through rapid growth. And so when they experience toxic stress, that can literally change the brain so that it develops differently than it would have otherwise. And what happens in adolescence is, first, they're still going through development, and so their brain is vulnerable. And it seems like the impacts of earlier stress start to manifest during adolescence. And so you can have a dog that seems quote unquote normal, that seems like everything seems to be fine, and then they hit adolescence and everything falls apart. And I mean, things tend to fall apart in adolescence anyway.
Yes.
But if you have a dog that has a history of toxic stress and or is currently experiencing toxic stress, that's going to be magnified. And I always joke, I say, if you've ever been a teenager, adolescence is a very difficult time. I happen to have a human teenager right now, so I'm living through it again from the outside. And we do have a little bit of research, really interesting research in dogs, actually, that suggests some changes during adolescence. So there was one study, and we need more, because we never want to do too much with the results of a single study. But there was one study that came out that showed that adolescent dogs their responsiveness to cues from their guardians decreases during adolescence, but their responses to cues from people outside of the family does not decrease. So it suggests that there may be this a little bit, I'm hesitant to say rebellion, but there may be something going on there that is actually similar to what we see in human adolescence in terms of this separation, right, of not I don't know, being less cooperative might be the right way to put it, during that period of time. But so in terms of what happens in the brain, the prefrontal cortex is one of the primary areas that's developing during adolescence. And that particular brain area is involved in all kinds of very important things like emotional regulation, and impulse control and decision making and focus. And so if an animal is experiencing toxic stress, we know that impacts the functionality and the development of the prefrontal cortex. And so then all of those things are impacted. either temporarily or potentially, in the long run, depending on how much stress there is and how the animal's able to cope with it.
Mhm.
And one last thing that I will say, since you mentioned your dog's response to the bin, is that we have it's a little murky, but we have some evidence that adolescents tend to sensitize to stressors. So adults are more likely to
Yeah.
habituate.
Mm.
Adolescents seem to be more likely to sensitize. And so we just have to be, and I think one of the things we can do, again, is make sure we're providing them with lots of support, which
Yeah.
means not correcting them, not yelling at them when they're doing these things, and giving them space to work through these things on their own. So if there's this scary bin that mysteriously
Yeah.
moves, then letting them, I mean, we have to have limits, right? Because we have to make sure that we can live our lives and that we're not
Yeah.
making other people upset or breaking laws or anything.
Yeah.
But if it's reasonable to do so, to kind of let your dog bark at that thing and then maybe get a little closer and then bark a little more and then give them the time they need to investigate this monster and find out that it's actually just,
Yeah.
something that's neutral. Because I actually think that process of investigation is very, very important for the development of resilience.
Yeah, yeah. And that's actually exactly what I did this morning. So I just kind of
Yeah.
got my other dogs out of the car, just let him bark because there was no one there and he's fine. He's like, he's keeping at a safe distance from this thing.
Yep.
And then I just called him away. And then we did a lap round. And then actually on the way back, he went to go and sniff the bin. And I just didn't even make a thing of it at all. Like I think a lot of I think as well, especially with when you've been training dogs,
Yeah.
is like at first this kind of behavior freaks you out. Like years ago, it would have freaked me out. I'd been like, oh
Right.
God, like, and I see
Yeah.
clients that freak out with their adolescent dogs all of the time.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas now I'm like, meh, whatever. Like it's like, like as long as I know he's okay and he's not in a complete like state of chronic stress or anything. And he bounces back very, very quickly. He's like, I'm gonna shout at this thing, and then he's like, okay.
Yeah.
Actually, he then sniffed it on the way back, and then he was, I didn't do anything with it. I just let him kind of be
Yeah.
and stuff. And so I think it's important as well during this time to not like make too much of a fuss of certain behaviors as well. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other factor too is that their vision is not as good as ours. And
Mm.
so I don't think they really can't process. Like we can look at it from a distance and say, oh, it's just a trash bin. But for them, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what it looks like, but they don't have the same kind of acuity of vision that we do. So I think it's just this huge big blob. And they know that when there's a
Yeah.
huge blob over there, that's not a threat. But
Yeah.
now there's a blob over here
Yeah.
and they don't know what that is or if it's a threat. And so it's actually, I think, a pretty normal response.
Yeah.
And where it becomes a problem is when we don't let them investigate
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And then they don't have the chance to learn that, okay, blobs move around
Yeah.
sometimes and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. But that also kind of also makes me think on the flip side is when people also try and kind of force those interactions, right? So
Mhm.
like maybe there was a scary experience with a dog at a dog park and now every single dog is kind of scary, but they get kind of taken back there the whole time and sort of flooded. And I think also that then, as you said, could result in like the brain developing differently and all of the things that kind of go along with that. And where it was just something maybe kind of adolescence related, like now it really is a bigger thing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and that kind of gets to the importance of giving them agency, right? And
Yeah.
giving them some level of control, as much control again as we reasonably and safely can
Yeah.
over their interactions, especially. And this is where I think learning body language becomes really, really
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
so that people are able to correctly interpret their dog's body language and respond
Yeah.
accordingly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
learning body language is a lifelong thing.
Yeah.
But one of the simplest things is, are they approaching or avoiding this interaction?
Mhm.
Right. And if they're avoiding it, it's really important to let them avoid it.
Mhm.
And, again, It's not necessarily going to be true in every single case. Like if they need emergency vet care, we can't really let them avoid it. But luckily, more and more now vet clinics are being aware of this, and they're implementing procedures to take that into consideration while still being able to administer that care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense, definitely. And then in terms of like stress, so again, I'm quite big in agility. I compete a lot. So like sometimes I see behaviors both in the ring and out the ring that are like completely, you know, quite stress related and stuff that their owners don't necessarily realize that their dogs are that stressed. But in terms of like, so obviously like the word arousal is thrown around a lot and stuff in the sports dog world and stuff. Can you, because I'd like to kind of talk about that a little bit. So first of all, can you like define arousal from like your perspective? And yeah, then we can talk about that and stress and stuff.
Yeah, so arousal is interesting because it's one of those terms. There's a couple of terms in the literature that are not really clearly defined.
Yeah.
And arousal is one of them, and reactivity actually is another one.
Okay.
But I think that most commonly what arousal is referring to is simply activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So remember, that's one half of the stress response. And what it is it's this increase in adrenaline and noradrenaline. And I mean, just think about, we'll just focus on adrenaline. Because everyone knows what adrenaline is and kind of what that impact is. So you have this increase in this arousal, this adrenaline response, and that again, and along with that is going this sort of hypervigilance and this increased response to threat, and increase in the heart rate and increase in respiration and all. I mean, everyone knows what an adrenaline response feels like, right? And so that's how I would define arousal. Most commonly, it's not defined in the literature, but the definitions I have been able to find are referring to that sympathetic nervous system arousal.
Okay. And like in terms of like, how is that kind of linked to stress? Like, because you hear that like arousal and anxiety are quite interlinked and stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm trying to think of how complex of an answer I want to give you. So it's one half of the stress response. So that's the simple answer, is that it is stress, right? It's just one half of the stress response.
Okay.
And so in the stress response, we have the cortisol increase, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or you can just think of it as the stress response axis. And then you have the sympathetic nervous system with the adrenaline and the noradrenaline. And we think, and it's, again, we need more research on this, but researchers have identified in a wide variety of species that there tends to be these two responses to stress, and animals respond in one of two ways, and it's a little bit murkier than that, but so you can have animals that have an active response to stress, and those are animals that are probably, and this research hasn't been done, but this is probably aligns with what we call dogs stressing up. So probably those are active responders to stress. And so they show increased approach, increased exploration. You can see an increase in aggressive behavior in those individuals. And in this case, what I'm talking about is offensive aggressive behavior, not fear-based. And this is in all kinds of species, so not just dogs, but mostly what we're talking about is this approach. It's also called a bold stress coping style or personality type. And it looks like so when an animal experiences stress, you get an increase in cortisol and you get that sympathetic nervous system activity. However, it looks different in these personality types. So in the active stress copers, you get a relatively higher increase. People can't see me. I'm doing all these little hand signals. You get a relatively higher increase in the sympathetic nervous system in that arousal, as opposed to cortisol. And cortisol is associated I mean, among other things, but we think that cortisol is one of the things that triggers a freeze response. This is a very long answer to your question. But,
No, it can be interesting.
yeah. So those are the bold copers. And I think we can all kind of envision a dog in our head that we feel like fits that profile. I have an Australian Shepherd that I think is 100% that profile.
Yeah.
And then you have the, I said bold, active is another word. It's interchangeable. And then you have your more passive or your shy stress copers. And those are the ones that probably correspond to dogs that we say are stressing down. And these guys have a relatively higher increase of cortisol compared to that increase in arousal. And they're less exploratory and more passive. And so they do a lot of this research in rodents. And just to give you an idea of what it might look like, active rodents that are active copers, if they put something in their cage that the rodent is scared of, they will bury it with bedding. The passive copers will just freeze. Right. So that kind of gives you an idea of how, like, one thing is sort of directly dealing with this stressor and the other thing is simply avoiding it. And so now I've completely forgotten the original question.
That's fine, keep talking. This is like
yeah. So, but that is one reason why you can see these different responses, right? And so you have some animals that are having this relatively higher increase in arousal. Whereas other animals are more, seem to become more passive when they're stressed. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, and I also can't now remember the original question. But so would you then treat those two types of responses differently?
So that's a really interesting question. And this is where things get tricky, because since we don't have research in those dogs, I have a hypothesis that the dogs that we work with that are stressing down are probably have this different physiological response than the dogs that we were working with that tend to stress up. If that hypothesis is correct, it suggests strongly that you would want to treat those things differently. So I just want to be really clear that we don't know if it's correct, but one thing for sure that it suggests to me, and I am not a veterinarian, but if we're going to put those animals on medication, you're probably going to want to use different medications, right? Because if one, the primary problem is that they're having this sort of overreaction of adrenaline and noradrenaline, and the other one, the problem is you have this over response of stress hormones. Well, those are two different physiological problems, and so we should treat them differently. So that's one thing. But I also think, and this is kind of, consistent anecdotally with what we do, if you have this bold or active stressor, really what we want to be working on is teaching that animal to manage their emotional arousal and to work on their impulse control. Whereas actually in both cases, there's really strong, intense emotions, but in the other case with the animals that are stressing down, maybe doing things like stress coping through confidence building and teaching them how to interact with stressors in a way that benefits them, giving them a lot more agency and choice and ability to not just avoid situations, but so kind of like with your dog, again, with the bin, if we can help increase their confidence so that they're more likely to investigate these situations and learn that they're safe, then that's ideal. Although we do have to be cautious, because if I have a very fearful dog that's barking and backing up or barking and approaching, whatever it is, my choice is not going to be, let's just let them interact with this human on their own and we'll let them work it out and see what happens, right? So there has to be that safety component too. But certainly with inanimate objects, trying to support them and going up and checking those things out, I think can be very beneficial for the those shy
Yeah.
dogs.
Yeah. I remember actually when my young collie was when she was a puppy and she was up in my office and I was just printing stuff and she hadn't heard the printer before. And again, she was like a 6-month-old collie. So you can imagine.
Right.
And she was like, again, she thought her world was going to end or something. It was like,
Right.
and
Right.
I just kind of stopped the printer and then we just had a few minutes and stuff. And then actually, I then played some food games with her. I was just playing like, just getting her to chase a bit of food and so on. And that just helped her recover. And then I just did a test the printer page, just got it printing. And then because I then paired that with a food game, she was like, oh, cool, this is fine and stuff. So it is about applying, I don't know, different things to different situations and just, using. But also as well, what you were saying about the 2 different types of dogs and how when you were talking about that, I was just thinking of like dogs I see regularly in agility and my clients' dogs and stuff. And I'm like, yep, he's one of those or she's one of those and stuff. So
yeah,
it makes so much sense. So
yeah, I'm one of those too. I'm a human.
Yeah, it probably is true for humans. And we know that humans have active and passive coping styles. And so passive coping actually is associated with less resilience, and both in people and in other animals. And so typically what they look at in other animals, and a lot of these studies are in wildlife, so they'll look at things like reproduction, disease susceptibility, and even survival. And it seems that the passive animals don't kind of do as well on that front, although it does depend a little bit, or maybe a lot, on the exact environment that they're living in. But in humans, passive coping styles are more associated with mental health challenges, which is not to say that like you should never avoid anything or you should always respond with really high arousal, right? But again, passive coping tends to avoid the stressor entirely, which is sometimes very appropriate. I mean, sometimes that is absolutely the best choice. But it also means that if the individual is doing that at an extreme level, they're not learning the skills they need to face the stressors that they can't avoid.
Yeah. And then in terms of like increasing resilience or better coping with stress, we all know about like exercise and diet and sleep and all of that, but what are some things that people can do for their dogs? And, like, I know it's very general, but then would there still be differences for the stressing up and stressing down dogs,
Yeah, so other than what we already talked about in terms of like impulse control for stressing up and confidence for stressing down, what I'm about to list, I mean, that's going to probably apply equally to either group. But so the first thing you can look at is the stressors themselves. So even though I said earlier the stressor itself doesn't matter so much, that's not 100% true. So more frequent stressors are going to be worse. More intense stressors are going to be worse. And stressors that are unpredictable and that the animal has no control over are going to be worse. So anything you can do to address those things. So we were talking earlier about dogs that are barking and lunging on leash, right? Can you walk your dog in a place where you're unlikely to see other dogs? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's absolutely not. But that's one thing to consider. Or is there a way where you can at least walk them in a place where they're not likely to be close to other dogs and they'll see them from a distance and you can move away? And then again, control over those stressors. And this is where I think being able to read and respond to body language becomes very important so that you can appropriately respond. So my dog, I think he's getting better, but last week, he was just holding himself. He's very, very stiff. And like when we pet him, he basically did nothing. And he was walking around with his head down and doing a lot of lip licking, but no other real signs of anything going on. But I was convinced that he was sick and he has a history of GI issues. So I took him to the vet and she ran blood work and did all these other things. And it turns out that he had pancreatitis. And so this is an example of a health issue, but of course that causes stress. I mean, I'm quite convinced that he was nauseous and in pain. And because I can recognize his body language, I was able to say something is wrong here and we need to do something.
Yeah.
And so I was able to reduce his stress by addressing the pain and the nausea. I mean, assuming, but that I'm pretty confident that that's what was, especially knowing the symptoms of pancreatitis.
Yeah.
And so, that's a
Yeah.
physical example, but that can apply to any situation where if we recognize that our animal is in distress, then we can respond to it. And this is probably something that sounds very obvious to professionals, and maybe less clear to guardians because they may not be aware of how much they're missing. My husband at one point,
Yeah.
as I was sort of getting increasingly anxious about the status of my dog, he's like, I think he's okay. He started moving around more. Like,
Yeah.
have you looked at him? He's still miserable.
Yeah.
And my husband is probably better than average at reading body language in dogs. So it's just, we can miss so much.
Yeah.
Don't know. And so that's one big thing, I think, is just thinking about what can I do to reduce these stressors that are causing, tolerable and toxic stress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other side of things is actually the resilience. I mean, that side is more sort of managing the environment. And I mean, it helps resilience because it decreases stress. But there are going to be stressors that we can't avoid. And we still want dogs that can deal with those. So there's 5 big things. There's exercise, enrichment, social support, and then again, predictability and control. And so exercise, I'm not going to go into exercise a whole lot, but these are things that it's not just like everyone says, oh, we need to exercise our dogs more, which is often true. But we actually know, for example, that exercise, again, it changes the brain. It produces additional chemicals in the brain that are actually very important for resilience. And there's lots of studies in humans and actually rodents too, that exercise can decrease like depression, for example. It's an anti-anxiety, antidepressant.
Yeah.
And so it's not just something we're saying out of thin air. There's actually really good data that it changes the body in ways that improve mood and decrease stress.
Yeah.
And I'll get to enrichment last because I think that's the most interesting. But how much time do we only have 5 minutes left? Okay. I'll try and be fast.
Okay.
So social support, people always ask me, what does that mean? Generally, what it means is having another safe animal present. And so typically, if you have a good relationship with your dog, simply by being there, you are providing social support. But to take it a step further, because of one of the myths that is out there, right? It directly contradicts this idea that you shouldn't comfort your dog when they're scared. The research actually says that you should actively comfort your dog when they're scared. And again, we have evidence that physical contact and the presence of another, usually it's a conspecifics, because again, much of this research is being done not in dogs. But having another animal even just nearby and present that is safe to the stressed animal does things like increase oxytocin, and we know that oxytocin counteracts the effects of cortisol and can actually bring it down. And so again, this isn't just things we're making up. There's actually really good data to support this. And the same kind of thing for control. So giving an animal control literally changes the brain to make them more resilient to stress. And then we also know that predictability helps. And my suspicion is that the reason predictability decreases stress is because it increases control. Because if you know it's happening, you can prepare for it. So I'm not sure that predictability and control are actually different things. I think predictability just increases control. So enrichment, and again, sometimes I feel like it's just this fluffy thing, like we just want to give our dogs toys and let them sniff things, and isn't that cute? But this is actually really, really, really important. So if you look at the definition of enrichment in the scientific literature, it's a little it can get a little complicated, and I'm just going to skip over that in the interest of time. But generally, they're talking about the ability to engage in species typical behavior and increase agency. And as a result, that has to improve well-being. So I think it's really interesting that the scientific definition of enrichment actually includes a criteria that well-being is being increased. And so if you're doing something for your dog that you're calling enrichment, and it's not actually making their life better, it's not enrichment, which means that we have to be evaluating it on an individual basis. So that's one thing. The other thing is there's now a whole lot of discussion about what's going on with enrichment. And again, we know that it changes the brain in ways that make animals more resilient to stress. And in rodents, if you do it early enough, so if you take and I mean, I'll just be open about it, right? Like most of the research that's being done in rodents is fairly disturbing, because they are doing pretty unpleasant things to them.
Yeah.
But if they, and the reason I talk about it is because it's already out there, and it can help us help other animals. But if you take rodents and you stress them out a whole bunch when they're young, or you stress their moms out while their moms are pregnant, that can have lifelong impacts on increasing anxiety and depression-like behavior, and basically making them less resilient to stress. But if you take those same rodents and you stress them out, and then very early in life, you provide them with a whole bunch of enrichment, you can actually reverse the impacts of that stress. And I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this sound like it's the super perfect solution. It's going to work in every case, because real life is much more complicated. But that does tell us how powerful enrichment can be. And again, it changes the brain, and it makes the animal more resilient. But what I find the most interesting about enrichment is now people are spending a whole lot of time talking about how providing animals with enriched environments, which gives them the opportunity to engage in different ways with their environment, increases their sense of agency, because they're now interacting with their environment, they're having impacts on their environment, and they're learning from that. And it therefore increases their competency, so that they are developing skills that they need to cope with future challenges. In other words, to deal with stress that they experience in the future. And so that, I think, is kind of our holy grail, like one of our main tools for increasing resilience. And that's why I was talking about the importance of letting these animals explore and letting your dog figure out that the bin is not a monster, because what you're actually doing is increasing their skills for dealing with real life. And when we go in and we're micromanaging them and trying to do everything for them and saying, no, 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 don't yell at that thing, come over here, heel, touch my hand. We're actually robbing them of the ability to learn how to cope with that on their own. And if you do that over and over and over again, then something really big happens, and the dog has no ability to cope with that situation, because they haven't been practicing it in these little, like, seemingly benign situations. So all of the things are important, but I think the sort of the two areas that I think are easiest for us to provide and likely to have the largest impact are agency and enrichment.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I think as well, a lot of people just think enrichment is giving your dog something like a stuffed Kong or whatever. It's so much more to it, isn't it? And I love what you've said about dogs being able to then deal with stuff based on you know, the enriching experiences they have and stuff. So yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you. Okay,
Yeah,
so
no
we've
problem.
loved chatting to you. We're out of time, unfortunately.
Yes.
But where can people find out more about you?
So my website is www.sciencemattersllc.com. And on there, you can find information on upcoming classes as well as events that I'm doing. And my book is up there. I also have my own podcast, which you can find on the website. And people have the opportunity to join my mailing list if they go to that website and keep updated on what's happening that way.
Oh, I was looking at your website earlier and I saw your membership with all the research things, and I was actually just saying to Angelique,
Yes.
I was like, I'm gonna join. This like looks amazing.
Yay!
You'll probably see me on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, we'll put all your links in the show notes and stuff. So, but thank you so much for coming on. We've just loved listening to you. It's been really, really good.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.